Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and as I do get asked quite a lot about this, I will give you guys just 3 quick little starter builds for the Turmoil and Mayhem race leagues, which are 10-day events of just pure madness and racing. Just a few little starter builds. These are builds that are designed to work relatively well off of low currency, low gear, and basically a completely fresh economy, but also have some good end game potential scaling, and they should be able to tackle the current game that is thrown at you in these 10-day races. 3 builds I will quickly go over are the Ice Shot Raider I played this league, the Sunder, or basically any sort of generic melee character as a Slayer or Gladiator, just a Duelist in that case, and the Trickster Scorching Ray, which is a very solid and reliable character as a spellcaster, but also a defensive sort of mana regen tank, which should just help you deal with basically everything the game is going to throw at you in these 10-day events. Now, this is not really the time to be going too hipster and too creative with your builds, because these 10-day events are pretty hectic on your well, life, with all of the stuff it throws at you, having a fresh economy, and especially if you're playing a hardcore solo self-found, you really cannot delve too far away from the meta. So without further ado, I'm going to start out with the Ice Shot Raider here for you. Now, the basis behind the Ice Shot Raider is to have a bow user that is basically dealing full cold damage through frenzies, scaling with Ice Bite, added cold damage, and a bunch of elemental damage on the tree, though however you will probably be using a physical bow to start with, or actually to deliver damage with. That's not too important. The bows themselves are just damage delivery devices for your cold damage itself. The characters themselves, they're not very expensive. They can scale up to be extremely expensive, but it should be a fairly decent character to play throughout maps, especially once you hit the map stage, for clear speed and then eventually single target. Now, bows themselves are not the easiest starters in these fresh economies, because bows really do kind of tend to want some good unique bows or a good bow to get going, as well as some decent gear all around. And until then, you may find it's not very fun to play a bow character through the leveling process. You'll probably have to be using Shrapnel Shot before you can jump into any sort of barrage action, and you'll probably have to run Pierce before you can start running any sort of chain either. Overall, it is kind of a tough and trying experience as a bow character, but once it does get up and running, it is a very strong one at that point. So it is entirely up to you if you want to do bows just to be a little bit different for a starter character, but it is not the easiest path to success as opposed to, say, the Sunder character or the Scorching Ray type thing, which basically sit at a constant level the entire time you are playing them. So pretty much all of the information about this character can be found in my previous videos on the Ice Shot Barrage Raider from a couple months ago for this Harbinger League, but I do want to go over it real quick in some of the basics and stuff you need to know, as well as the way you'd level. So basically, this is the tree we're looking at. You can run a Lionized Jewel and get these over here, so if that's available to you, then that means you can free up a few passives here or there, but this is what the tree is going to look like. So we do start off with a physical bow. In the end, you run Chinsol for your single target damage because it's really good with Barrage up close, so try and get one of those when you can, and a Death's Opus for our clear. You can also use a Death's Harp until you get one of these, or a Lionized Bow until you end up getting one of these too, or just use the Lionize altogether permanently, but you will need some crit strikes to go with your main setup, because the Lionized Bow itself has some pretty low crit. So these aren't terribly easy to level with. Like I said, you will want to run Shrapnel Shot for quite a long time, and then probably also Lightning Arrow with LMP, and chances are you're going to take some of these nodes to start with because they're really good for helping your damage early on and leveling, and then refund them later because they didn't end up being terribly worth it for us. But you probably grab some of these over here, and then I'd say you'd start traveling here, grabbing the bow nodes and the Ellie nodes, getting some of the life nodes, then probably, Jesus, this is weird. I'd say you'd go up here, grab this, and then start filling out some of this. Meanwhile, make sure you do get a few of the frenzies once you start getting the frenzy raider ascendancies. So over here and up here, that's when the frenzies start to shine. And once you get Ice Bite into your setup, which is both in the Ice Shot setup. This will be our main 5-link, and the Barrage setup, which will be our 6-link over here. Never really even got to use Ellie Focus in my main setup because I only had 5 links. So your priority for Barrage, once you get it, will probably be Barrage, added Cold, Ice Bite, and Ellie damage with attacks, I'd say. And then Cold Pen should be your last one, because you do get a fair amount of cold penetration from the tree over here, 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 and also from Frost Bomb, as well as a Wise Oak, which I am not currently running on this character. Otherwise, for your Ice Shot, your priority will probably be Ice Shot, Ellie damage with attacks, GMP, and then beyond that, you don't really want to run Chain until your gear is good enough. You'll probably just run the Ice Shot Jewels and run something like Ice Bite or added Cold instead. So keep your eyes on that and mix around your setup as you need to. But this is the basics of the character. It is pretty simple. At the end, it's just frenzies, cold damage scaling, and you're going bows, as well as picking whatever skill you want really for clear, because it doesn't necessarily have to be Ice Shot. It could be Lightning Arrow, it could be Tornado Shot, but Ice Shot felt really nice with the whole theme of the character. The gear is not anything particularly special. Dark Rays are probably going to be your boots of choice. Don't have to run an Aerials, you can run whatever chest you want. Belly of the Beast, for example, gets you a lot of life. And overall, you'd probably replace your Dying Sun, because it's going to be too expensive, with a Wise Oak, so that you'll have Diamond, a Series Promise, a Quicksilver, an Eternal Life Flask, and a Wise Oak. On Jewels, you're looking for projectile damage, cold damage, bow attack speed, life, some crit multi with cold skills. All that stuff is not too bad. And as far as our skills go, the only other things we really need to mention is you're going to be running Herald of Ice with Curse on Hit, Assassin's Mark. That's for your power charges. Your other reservation will go towards Hatred, and make sure you use a Frost Bomb, because that is going to be a large part of your single target damage with the negative cold resist. The next obviously highly recommended character is the Sunda Duelist. Now I do say Duelist because you can definitely be Gladiator or Slayer and play it up to pretty high levels of content. You can even be a champion if you really want to get some extra hipster points in there. As well as that, you could run Raider, you could run Berserker. There's quite a lot of choices for a build like this, but the basis of it is pure physical damage almost entirely. You do still have some Hatred and some Herald of Ash, but it's a physical weapon. You're dealing lots of physical damage, maybe some bleed explosions if you can fit them in, and you're just using Sunder to attack fast, hit really hard, and it does clear the game very reliably because the characters are super tanky. They have great clear speed and a pretty decent single target in the end once you've built it just right. Sunder just starts amazingly right from level 12 and keeps going, so it carries you right through the game and should feel really good for both Turmoil and Mayhem. And don't feel too bad playing it if it's just a meta thing, because it is what it is. It's a tough life out there in these races, and Sunder really does help get you through the line. That said, they are pretty generic melee builds, and other skills of choice that are pretty damn good for this sort of thing are also Cleave, Cyclone, and pretty much whatever else you want to try, maybe some Earthquake. That said, I think Sunder is the strongest choice of that lot. Now, the true strength in these Sunder and Duelist sort of melee builds are that they are really good in just low gear, solo self-found right from the get-go starter situations. So because it's always a very largely strength-based tree and there's a lot of life around this area, you're constantly picking up lots of life and hitting relatively hard with the Sunder skill throughout the leveling experience. So it is a very smooth experience, and eventually you grab Resolute Techniques, which is just an easy way of forgetting about all of your accuracy, and that means your gear is typically pretty flexible. You're mostly just looking for resists, life, maybe a bit of extra physical damage if you can fit it in. And the other thing that's great about this is you can basically pick whatever weapon and skill setup you want. So you don't necessarily have to go maces, you don't even have to go one-handers or dual wield. It is very much up to the gear you find. So that's the strength that I've found in playing this sort of character very early on, is that you go where the gear takes you. If you find a really good two-handed axe, you can spec into the two-handed axe sort of thing and be purely two-hand based and axe based. If you find a really good one-handed mace, then you start going dual wield and you become completely one-hand and dual wield reliant. So you really go where the gear takes you. And in this character, the one that I just highlighted a few days ago, it was a gladiator running maces, and using Sunder. So you can also use one-handed axes for Sunder that are really good. And the choice offhand that I used was Prismatic Eclipse because it gives you a lot of extra attack speed when you use 3 green sockets and some good block chance. That said, a higher damage sort of offhand would be a Princess or a Tempestuous Steel, so keep your eyes peeled for those if you're going to do some dual wield action. And like I said, you don't necessarily even have to be Gladiator. Gladiator was my choice because it gave quite a lot of block and utility in that sense, so we end up getting about 44 block and spell block. As well as that, you had the bleed explosions, which can be taken care of with hemophilia gloves if you're going Slayer or Champion, and then a nice way of generating frenzy charges. If, however, you go Slayer, you do get some pretty nice goodies as well. Lots of Onslaught, some Cull for 20%, a bunch of extra damage, the reduced Reflect, which does end up being fairly useful in the end game, and you grab these Leech Nodes over here, which do end up making you very tanky. So you won't have anywhere near as much block as the Gladiator because you shouldn't really bother at that point. You just get a lot of life and then a bunch of life leech. You run Blood Rage, that's where you get your frenzy charges from. Probably still do the same thing I did in this character, and that is spec into some frenzies and get some single target frenzy action happening. But you don't have to be dueled in the Slayer setup, so you can, and I'll link this for you guys as well, have a nice little example of a Slayer Sunder with a two-handed weapon instead. So we don't really get any block whatsoever because we're two-handed based. You can get more life if you really want from the passive tree, but this is what I found was good. You don't even have to really go this far because you only get frenzies, so it's not necessarily that great. But it is a flexible passive tree. You can go axes, you can go maces, you can even go swords and play something like Lacerate. It's a fairly generic tree, so by all means go for it. This one currently has a Disfavor equipped, and you can see it's higher damage than the previous Gladiator template I had. If you just have a shitty Val axe that has nothing but Merciless and attack speed on it, so 430 DPS, you still deal quite a lot of damage in the end, so 600k, that is against Shaper. Though if you're going for, you know, a fresh league start or a race, expect to probably achieve something like half this number, and that should still be very good and well, good enough to take care of most content you'll come across in those sorts of races. Now, ideally, you're getting some Lion's Roar, some Witchfire, and some Atziri's Promise action. That might be pretty hard to come by. Keep in mind, a Stibnite Flask is really nice, even without the Witchfire Brew. Lion's Roar, you probably won't be able to get too easily, so just a Granite Flask is fine. And otherwise, Atziri's Promise, you should be able to get fairly early on, or eventually, without too much effort. As far as leveling the build goes, you'll probably just go through here. If you're going to commit to two-handers, then you start going here two-handed. If you're going to commit to dual wield, you go through here, and then try and keep it fairly generic. So try and take your two-hand nodes or your dual wield nodes, go left, and then go through here and into the Marauder area. Once you're more ready to commit to a weapon spec, you start taking these special nodes, but try and keep it generic because you never really know where you're going to go with your weapon nodes until you have a really solid idea of what you want to do, or until you find the weapon you're trying to eventually build around. Try and get Resolute Techniques by around level 60 because that's when your accuracy really starts to drop off. And then lastly, I wanted to suggest Scorching Ray Trickster. Now, Scorching Ray can be played as a Trickster or a Scion Ascendant to a pretty high level, but Trickster is probably more friendly for the solo self-found or the early game experience because you do go Mind Over Matter, you get a lot of extra mana regen, and it makes for a pretty strong character overall defensively and offensively, though Scorching Ray isn't really for everyone. It is just a bit more of a bland skill and build, but it is very strong in these low gear situations, which is why it's definitely recommended for this if you want to play more of a caster. If you're looking for a more exciting caster, I'd say something like a Magma Orb Inquisitor can go a long way, but it is much more of a struggle early on, and it's definitely a bit tougher in these intense race situations. As well as that, you could also try Blade Vortex Inquisitor. In any case, this is a Scorching Ray, and it does take a little bit to ramp up to its really fast form until you get all the Ascendancy and quite a bit of attack speed and cast speed. It won't be truly that fast, but it will be very reliable right from the get-go when you get it at level 12. The cast speed that you get from the build affects the rotation speed, so make sure you try and get a good bit of cast speed if you want to be able to rotate faster and stack your burns faster. Scorching Ray is purely burn and fire based, so you get your elemental equilibrium going from the Orb of Storms that you can see I drop quite occasionally, and that triggers them to have -50 fire resist because you hit with lightning, and that is where you get a lot of your damage from. And since Scorching Ray itself does not actually have a hit portion, it just applies a burn debuff over time. It does not re-trigger the elemental equilibrium at all, and then you get lots of benefit from EE that way. So it is just a burn stacking debuff, and it is a pretty satisfying skill to play, but not really for everyone, as I have mentioned. So please don't blame your distaste or lack of enjoyment in Scorching Ray on me. I'm doing the best I can, giving you a nice caster build to play for a short-term notice sort of race. In any case, let's get into the intricacies. So the passive tree that you run as a Trickster Scorching Ray has a very strong start because it gives you lots of beginning elemental damage, some good life nodes, and as well as that, some good little regen nodes over here, and some extra attack speed, and it's got a good mix of strength, int, and dexterity, so it is a fairly strong start just right from the get-go. You then travel through to the witch area and try and get to elemental equilibrium as soon as possible, because like I said, dropping the Orb of Storms is very important for our build to get minus fire resist. You'll then probably grab elemental overload, because that's also an absolutely huge buff for the build, and then take mind over matter whenever you're ready and whenever you feel like you have enough mana to really start taking advantage of that defensively. For me, that personally is probably once you get some of the right ascendancies. I think when I first started this, my ascendancy to begin with was Swift Killer. I then would have went Patient Reaper, then would have gone Weave the Arcane, and lastly Walk the Ether. Probably once you get Weave the Arcane is when you want to go for Mind Over Matter, but it's up to you guys, and see how you go when you're leveling it yourself. So the passive tree from then on is basically up to you. You can go up, down, side to side, whatever. The start is basically just this into this and then this. I'd probably then hit up Templar myself personally. The strength in a build like this is it is very sort of a low impact from gear. The only real things that matter when it comes to damage or increasing the clear speed of the build are essentially your weapon and some of your jewels. So the rest of this stuff is basically just going to be resists, life, and mana regen, just trying to get the overall survivability of the build up, but there's very little you can do for actual damage in the build. It's mostly just going to be up to your gems and your passives, and ultimately your jewels. And you're looking for spell damage, burn damage, damage over time, spell damage with shield, maybe some cast speed if you need it, if you feel like you're running low, and ultimately a Witchfire Brew is what you're going for, just to save yourself a Blasphemy vulnerability, so that you can then run Blasphemy vulnerability and Blasphemy flammability. And your flasks are also very sort of up to you. The only one I would say you really want to focus on early on is a Sulphur Flask, because it drops Consecrated Ground, which gives you a lot of life regen, which is the main defensive perk we run with in this build. You can see we have about 6k life, and my current life regen with everything up and everything going is 27%. So your life regen just skyrockets whenever you get attacked, and that is largely because we're standing in Consecrated Ground thanks to the Sulphur Flask, and because we have a lot of regen from the tree, as well as the Trickster node Patient Reaper. Whenever you've killed something, boom, lots of extra regen. Now the Scorching Ray itself, right from level 12, is pretty good, but it does not get completely ramped or really start to feel good till about level 18. At level 18, you'll pick up Early Focus and Controlled Destruction, get that going in a 3-link, and that's when your damage starts to really do quite nice things. After that, you probably grab Burn Damage, and then Efficacy, and lastly Swift Affliction, and right from the 4-link, it will be a very strong setup and should kill things, including bosses, really nicely and smoothly. Either Shield Charge, Whirling Blades, either or, that's fine, doesn't really matter. If you're using a Doriani's Catalyst, you can only Shield Charge though, and ultimately you only reserve your mana for Clarity and Arctic Armor. As well as that, you can do some Orb of Storms with Flammability Curse on hit, that's what I chose to do, or you can go Blasphemy, but the more mana you have unreserved, the better your Mind Over Matter and regen will end up feeling. Overall, what you're trying to look for in your gear is just a bit of extra mana regen so that your mind over matter is going to be stronger, and then just life. So try and look out for that, because in the end, we do have about 500 mana regen. Anything under 200 or 300 is not going to feel great for mind over matter in the end game when you're taking big hits and you just can't recover your mana fast enough to then keep attacking or keep taking damage. I'd say that's about all I got for you guys for now, just these 3 builds. A lot of the builds I've played in the past few months on Harbinger can be used as starter builds, so feel free to just look through the old YouTube or the build list, because there's a lot of stuff you can pick there. These are just 3 that I can recommend to you that should be pretty strong if you know what you're doing, more or less, or even more on the lower end for absolute starter goodness. I personally am probably going to be playing the Sunder, maybe Slayer, maybe Gladiator. I rarely give myself the best opportunity to succeed and start out with a really nice sort of flavor of the month character. I usually try and do something a bit hipster. It's either going to be those or probably the Ice Shot Raider, because I just love starting as a bow character or playing a bow character in these sorts of events. It ends up being really fun, getting your entire gear going and watching the progression and the build-up of your character. And as well as that, I do kind of want to be competitive and maybe go for a top 5 finish in the hardcore solo self-found league, I think, because it's just a little bit more fun that way. So it's either going to be one of those, I think, Sunder as a Slayer, Gladiator, or some Ice Shot Raider. That's my personal preference, I think, and that's probably what I will go with. Hope this video has helped you, given you a bit of guidance. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.